we're looking at one more topic or philosophy in this class today. Although, to even call it a philosophy kind of misses the mark. What I'm going to be presenting for you today is, well, it's not something that you could really call a philosophy of life, like the other ones that we've looked at. In fact, it's not something that I can really tell you or teach you about at all. And so this lecture is going to be kind of paradoxical today. I'm going to be giving you some concepts and some ideas, but fundamentally, this thing that we're looking at is not a concept. It's not an idea. It's not a way of understanding the world. It's a way of moving within it. And that'll become clear as we go through some of the features of Eastern philosophy today. And so I asked you to read one chapter from Alan Watts's book, Tao, the Watercourse Way, in which he tries to explain what Taoism is to a Western audience. Alan Watts was a thinker. Some called him a spiritual guru. Very funny guy. You can find all sorts of his lectures on YouTube on various things in Eastern philosophy, Western philosophy. But what he basically tried to do during his life was make Eastern philosophy more accessible to Western audiences. So I'm going to try to touch on that vein today and follow through on that as well. Because what we're going to be looking at is, again, not something that can really be conceptualized or understood. It's something that is very strange given the Western way that we understand and move within reality. See, ever since the time of the ancient Greeks and Romans, our way of thinking and being in the West has been based on Aristotelian logic. Aristotelian. For example, what is this? Coffee? A cup? Mug? I don't know, whatever you want to call it. Can this be both a coffee and not a coffee at the same time? No, right? What is this? It's a piece of chalk. Can this be both a piece of chalk and not a piece of chalk at the same time? No, you're looking at me like a crazy person, right? You're like, what the fuck are you talking about? Of course, right? This is known as the principle of non-contradiction. Okay? Something either is or is not. It has a property or it doesn't have that property. It can't both have the property and not have the property. That doesn't make any fucking sense, right? So this grounds how we see the world. It's an example of Aristotelian logic. Another way that we see the world is it's kind of dualistic. And I don't mean that necessarily in the metaphysical sense, where we all just implicitly accept that there's matter and then there's spirit, and these are two different things. But I mean it more so like this. There are things that are hot and things that are cold. Things that are heavy and things that are light. We think of things as good or evil, progressive or conservative, artificial or natural. Right? We have these kind of binary categories that we use and that we place things within. We think of things as sacred or profane, dumb or stupid, or dumb or smart, sorry. So our way of thinking is very dualistic in that regard. We kind of split the world up into binary categories. Finally, the way that we see the world, which is associated with this dualistic conception or phenomenology, is we split things in the world up between subjects and objects. We have this subject-object distinction at the basis of our thinking and our understanding in the world. We saw this when we looked at existentialism, right? You can conceive of yourself as a subject who has free will, or an object who's just a part of this natural causal order that's pushed and pulled by all of these things that you can't control. We think of human beings as having agency, tables and chairs as not having agency, right? They're objects. They have no control over their lives. All of these things are inherent to our Western way of thinking and seeing the world. Okay? All of the systems that you see around you, the philosophies that we've been looking at, have been kind of based intensely on these things. Aristotelian logic, like the principle of non-contradiction, splitting the world up into binary categories, subject-object distinction. This is not the way that other cultures necessarily see the world. More specifically, Eastern thinkers and philosophers, like those in Southeast Asia for the last at least few thousand years. Eastern philosophy, then, is very different than Western philosophy. And so, Taoism, what we're going to be looking at today, is not going to understand the world in these terms. So if we're going to try to understand what this book has to say, the Tao Te Ching, or this book, Tao the Watercourse Way, we're going to have to try to break out of our intensely conditioned way of seeing and understanding the world. I'm going to try my best to do that, but ultimately, as we'll see, the kind of thing that I'm going to be presenting for you today is it's not knowledge that I can transmit to you. It's not a concept. It's not even a theory. Okay? So as we go through the lecture, just try to keep that in the back of your minds. The seminal text that Taoism is based on, the Tao Te Ching, was written a long time ago. It was attributed to this guy named Lao Tzu. We think Lao Tzu was a real historical figure, but there are some, how we might say, embellished stories about him. Like, for example, his name literally means old boy when translated, and it's said, according to myths, that he was born with a full white beard. Pretty interesting, right? Well, this text, the Tao Te Ching, was written during a very important time in Chinese history, what's known as the Warring Period. Does this sound like a nice time to be living? The Warring Period? Not really, right? It was a very turbulent, chaotic time in Chinese history in which there wasn't so much a unified government and nation as there was a bunch of different warring states and warlords and groups vying for power and control. Okay? Is that even how you spell that? I don't even know. Yeah. Okay. And so, this philosophy of Taoism is influenced by the historical context in which it arose. It is a kind of way of life that tries to Well, provides some sort of comfort, peace, and security to those who are going through such a chaotic time. A time filled with violence and bloodshed and insecurity, grasping, control, death. Thus, Taoism, as we'll see, was a way of life that was formulated in response to some very real social and historical events that were occurring around this time. And as such, it has a particular flavor to it, this Taoism. Now, I've told you already that it's based on ancient Eastern Chinese philosophy. Let's break that down a little bit more so you have a better sense of what exactly we're getting into here and how it differs from this stuff. Okay? This very Western way of seeing and understanding the world. I'm sure you've all seen this symbol before. What is that? What symbol is that? Maybe one of you have a tattoo of it? I don't know. Right! Exactly. Far from being just a cool picture, this symbol is central to the Eastern way of thinking and understanding the world. Okay? Taoism, too, is informed by this. You could call it a concept, you could call it a symbol, you could call it a lens. What this is supposed to represent is the polarity of the universe. See, in the Western world, we split things into binary categories. Things are either good or evil, dumb or smart, progressive or conservative. Things are either one thing or another thing. A thing can't be both a table and not a table at the same time. Well, that's not the way that these ancient Chinese thinkers saw the world. If in the West we see and understand the world as dualistic, in the East they see and understand the world monistically, as this whole thing being one giant interconnected system or organism in which no thing is really disconnected or distinct from any other thing. Everything exists in relation to every other thing and forms this complex, transcendent whole. This concept, too, is also supposed to be representative of that worldview, that monistic way of understanding what all this is and how all of this works. This symbol or concept, yin-yang, represents the polarity of the universe in which all things exist in relation to each other. And they are interdependent and interconnected. This way of understanding the world becomes more intuitive once you think about your own person and your relation to what you consider to be the outside world. When did your life begin? It's a hard question to answer, right? How about this? What caused you to come into existence? Can we definitively answer that? You could say, maybe it was when I was conceived by my parents. Is that what caused you? Really? Didn't something cause that? And didn't something cause that to happen? I suppose we could trace back the cause of anything back to the cause of the universe, if that's even a thing, if the universe did have an origin or a beginning. Taoism is steeped in this Eastern way of understanding the world, where the universe is taken to be more monistic. Again, there's this giant interconnected system that we're all part of, that's very much like an organism. There is no real distinction between subjects and objects, because again, everything is part of this interconnected system. There are no firm distinctions between things. As we'll see, the Taoists are going to say everything is a part of the Tao, and we'll try to define that later. And they also deny this principle of non-contradiction. It is not the case that a thing cannot have a property and not have a property. In essence, that is what this symbol or concept is trying to represent. There is no separating the light from the heavy, or the light from the dark, or the good from the evil. They exist in relation to one another, and they cannot be separated. We imagine these things in our world, good and evil, progressive and conservative, as warring with each other, wanting one to win over the other. But the ancient Eastern thinkers think that this is foolish and nonsensical. There cannot be any ultimate triumph of one or the other because their existences are interdependent and interconnected. You cannot have one without the other. It makes no sense to talk about the earth without invoking the heavens implicitly, or talking about cold without invoking the idea of hotness. And so to help explain this idea, Watts discusses it on pages 19 and 20. The yin-yang polarity. At the very roots of Chinese thinking and feeling, there lies the principle of polarity, which is not to be confused with the ideas of opposition or conflict. In the metaphors of other cultures, light is at war with darkness, life with death, good with evil, and the positive with the negative. And thus an idealism to cultivate the former and be rid of the latter flourishes throughout much of the world. To the traditional way of Chinese thinking, this is as incomprehensible as an electric current without both positive and negative poles. For polarity is the principle that plus and minus, north and south, are different aspects of one and the same system, and that the disappearance of either one of them would be the disappearance of the system. So, the first thing that we need to try to wrap our minds around is this idea that we're all part of this one interconnected underlying whole, and really there is no firm distinction between any things. Although we think and act in that way as we are socially conditioned to do so. Now, this isn't the full story. As you'll see, this understanding is only one step in the spiritual development of this Eastern way of thought, but it is a crucial step that we must first make. So, in some real way, everything exists in relation to everything else. We cannot make sense of one thing without taking that thing as one node in a complex web of relationships and ideas. All things are somehow interconnected and interdependent. Continuing on, Watts says this. The key to the relationship between yang and yin is called, and please, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation here, Hisheng Sheng, mutual arising or inseparability. I'm spelling this right. As Lao Tzu puts it, when everyone knows beauty as beautiful, there is already ugliness. When everyone knows good as goodness, there is already evil. To be and not to be arise mutually. Difficult and easy are mutually realized. Long and short are mutually contrasted. High and low are mutually posited. Before and after are in mutual sequence. Thus Watt says, they are thus like the different but inseparable sides of a coin, the poles of a magnet, or pulse and interval in any vibration. There is never the ultimate possibility that either one will win over the other, for they are more like lovers wrestling than enemies fighting. It is thus of interest that a common Chinese expression for sexual intercourse is hua chen, the flowery combat, in which, of course, there is no wish in either partner to annihilate the other, but something like a dance is occurring. It is difficult in our Western logic to see that being and non-being are mutually generative and mutually supportive. For it is the great and imaginary terror of Western man that nothingness will be the permanent end of the universe. We do not easily grasp the point that the void is creative, and that being comes from non-being as sound from silence and light from space. Okay, everybody be quiet for a second. Imagine it's quiet. I know you can hear the stuff out there, right? Ah! Where did that sound come from? You'd say, it came from you, Professor Gunner. Well, it came from silence, right? The sound originated from silence. How the fuck does that happen? How does that work? This is something that we need to try to kind of grasp or intuit or feel. 30 spokes unite at the wheel's hub. It is the center hole, literally, from there not being, that makes it useful. Shape clay into a vessel. It is the space within that makes it useful, right? Imagine a vase. Terrible vase, I know. What makes a vase useful? The fact that it has emptiness, space within it, right? So you can put shit in it. It is the space within that makes it useful. Cut out doors and windows for a room. It is the holes which make it useful. Therefore, profit comes from what is there, usefulness from what is not there. So, what we need to understand if we're going to try to wrap our minds around Taoism is that it's based in this way of thinking that is completely foreign to us, most of us. It's informed by this idea that all of what you see around you, including your own life and experiences, the animals, the trees, the buildings, is just part of this same one whole underlying system, a monism. But that all of these different things that you see around you are just particular manifestations of this one underlying thing that have different degrees of polarity to them. Some things maybe have more light than darkness. Maybe some things have more heaviness than lightness. Some things are more hot than cold. Some things are more soft than rough. But that these things ultimately coexist, they arise together, and they cannot be separated. Thus, we could say that Taoism is also informed by this idea, which we saw in Transcendentalism, that all is one. You remember us looking at that? Informed by this monistic idea of the universe. But even to call it a monism, again, is to view this way of seeing the world through a distinctly Western lens. So this word that I've given you still misses the mark in a sense. Because as we'll see, what Watts is trying to explore and get at here is not something that, again, is really a theory or a concept at all. It is a way of being. See, in the West, the way that we see the world and live and act is so, it prioritizes thought so heavily. You are a good person if you have the right beliefs. You will go to heaven or hell depending on if you have the right understanding or beliefs. Right? You're a dumb person or a smart person depending on what you know, the concepts that are available to you, the knowledge that you have. In other parts of the world, this is not how people think and act. So, within Eastern philosophy, there is an emphasis on experience, not thought. These are two very different things. So try to keep that in the back of your mind. The important point I'm trying to get y'all to see right now is that according to Taoism and other Eastern philosophies like Buddhism and Hinduism, in which it's, you could say, everything that you see around you is something like God playing hide and seek with itself. There are no real boundaries or distinctions between things. Ultimately, everything is a part of the same underlying interconnected system. So this is giving us some background in Eastern philosophy generally, and some of the main ideas on which Taoism is based. Let's actually start talking about what Taoism is more specifically. Maybe it would be useful to define the Tao. Right? We're talking about Taoism. What is the Tao? What the hell does that mean? Well, another difficulty arises. Allow me to read the first section of the Tao Te Ching to you. Lao Tzu says, the Tao, or the way that can be told, is not the real way. The name that can be named is not the constant name. The nameless was the beginning of heaven and earth. The named was the mother of the myriad creatures. Hence, always rid yourself of desires in order to observe its secrets. But always allow yourself to have desires in order to observe its manifestations. These two are the same, but diverge in name as they issue forth. Being the same, they are called mysteries, mystery upon mystery, the gateway of manifold secrets. And now you're thinking to yourself, what the fuck does that mean? How does that have any application in my life? Why are we even looking at all of this in this class? Well, because what Watts is looking at here is a way of life that can free us, perhaps, from a lot of the stress and worry that we have. From the way that we've set up all of this stuff, our prioritization of thinking, of the past and the future, of stress and worry. That is why this is all important. The problem is, though, to talk about it misses the mark. This is the difficulty, okay? The Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. What does that mean? The kind of way of life, way of experiencing this life that Taoism is trying to capture cannot be captured in words or concepts or categories. To even call this way of life Taoism is already false. Why? How can you put a name to this interconnected underlying system of which we are all a part, that is bigger than us, that is infinite and mysterious, nonsensical, you might think? You can't put a name to it. Putting a name to it does not capture it. In a way, this way of life cannot be defined at all. It is not something I can explain to you. It is captured not in thought and category, but in a certain kind of experience. And experience always escapes language. See, in the West, we try to capture the world in boundaries and numbers and categories and terms and concepts. But all of this stuff is not the word that we use for it. It's not the numbers that we use to define it in space. It's something else, right? When you're talking to your friends, you'll say something like, I was suffering yesterday. But that word does not capture what you were feeling, right? In some real way, there's no way you could communicate what you were feeling to your friends because it's known only to you. It's experiential. Well, the same thing is true of this thing that I'm trying to present to you today. It is not a thing. And so I can't present it to you, though I'm going to try my darndest, which is why this whole class is going to be paradoxical and weird. Okay? Which is why when an Eastern Zen master once met with Alan Watts and said, you've written a lot of books on this stuff. You seem to have a lot to say about Eastern philosophy. He said, I haven't said a thing. Because this cannot be said, in essence. If that makes sense to you, you're following along. Good. If not, just listen to this lecture over again at some point. So, Taoism, what is it? Well, it's based on this thing called the Tao. What is the Tao? Well, to mistakenly describe it, it is the course, the flow, the drift, or the process of nature. Basically, the Tao is all of this. All of this that's happening. And I'm gesturing towards everything. All right? What that means is there's no stepping outside of it. This table is a part of the Tao. This chalk is a part of the Tao. Your feelings and experiences are a part of the Tao. What happened in 1594 is part of the Tao. The leaves growing on the trees, the insects eating the leaves, the animals shitting in the woods, all of that is part of the Tao. Okay, it's everything. It's everything, and it's everything that's happening. So we're a part of it as well. Everything is a part of it. This is a different way of thinking about the universe, and what you might say grounds it or governs it. The Tao is not the same thing as the Christian God. Okay? It's very different. How does Christianity, at least in the Protestant West, understand what God is? Well, Protestant Christianity nowadays conceptualizes the universe as this thing that was created by God. There's this thing called God, and then there's this thing called God's creation. And we're a part of God's creation, but we're separate from God, right? God is somehow existing outside of time and space and is like some sort of lawgiver or ruler or sovereign that establishes order, that created all this, that's having a hand in how all this goes. That's separate from his creation. That's not the Tao. The Tao is not separate from nature. What is part of nature is part of the Tao. Okay? The Tao, in some sense, does not exist outside of time and space like we think of God as existing. It's a part of the universe. Well, it is the universe in some sense. We could say perhaps time and space are like manifestations of the Tao. I don't know, something like that. It's basically the totality of all things. What they are doing. How they are going on. The relationships between all these things. It cannot be defined in words or concepts, as I have said over and over again, because all of this one system that we're all a part of, cannot be captured with any words, categories, or concepts. To do so is to take a slice of it, not really the whole thing, right? Like when I look at you and I say, you are this race, or you are this gender, that does not completely capture you, right? It only captures a part of you. If you've ever heard the phrase, go with the flow, that's a very Taoist phrase, okay? The Tao is not a concept or an idea, and so Taoism is not a theory, it's not a philosophy. Odd, then, that we're studying it in a philosophy class. But useful, I think. The Tao is a real thing. Although even to use the word thing does not capture it, because the Tao is not a thing. Right? The Tao is what is. And what is not just a thing. Right? Like a table or a coffee mug or a wallet, although all things are part of the Tao, if that makes sense. The Tao is beyond categorization. It is beyond understanding. It is not something that can be understood. It is only something that can be felt or experienced in some sense. And so Watts says this about it. Tao cannot be defined in words and is not an idea or concept. As Chuang-Tzu says, it may be attained but not seen, or in other words, felt but not conceived, intuited but not categorized, divined but not explained. In a similar way, air and water cannot be cut or clutched, and their flow ceases when they are enclosed. There is no way of putting a stream in a bucket or the wind in a bag. Verbal description and definition may be compared to the latitudinal and longitudinal nets which we visualize upon the earth and the heavens to define and enclose the positions of mountains and lakes, planets and stars. But earth and heaven themselves are not cut by these imaginary strings. As Wittgenstein said, laws, like the law of causation, treat of the network and not of what the network describes. In other words, we have categories and concepts and words for all of these things, but those concepts, categories, and words are not the things themselves. Right? We use the word table to describe this thing, but the word table is not this thing. Right? You use Professor Gunner when you speak to me, but Professor Gunner is not what this is. Right? I'm more than that. I'm like a living subjectivity that cannot be captured by a word. The game of Western philosophy and science is to trap the universe in networks of words and numbers, so that there is always the temptation to confuse the rules or laws of grammar and mathematics with the actual operations of nature. We must not, however, overlook the fact that human calculation is also an operation of nature. But just as trees do not represent or symbolize rocks, our thoughts, even if intended to do so, do not necessarily represent trees and rocks. Thoughts grow in brains as grass grows in fields. Any correspondence between them is abstract, as between 10 roses and 10 stones, which does not take into account the smell and color of the roses, or the shapes and structures of the stones. Although thought is in nature, we must not confuse the game rules of thought with the patterns of nature. So, we try to use all of these systems and theories and concepts to describe what the hell is going on. But those things are always going to fall short, right? Because the rules, the concepts, the ideas are not the same thing as what's actually happening, right? They're just descriptors. Thus, the Tao basically operates the same way. We can't really describe it or encapsulate it or define it. Because the Tao is what's happening, it's not the language or the concepts that we use to understand what's happening. As we've said before, according to Taoism, everything or event is what it is only in relation to everything else. We cannot make sense of hot without cold, light without heavy, up without down, north without south, left without right. They all exist, or we might say come into existence at the same time together, and they have some sort of dependence and relationship on each other. The meaning of each thing or event is a function of how that thing or event relates to everything else. This is what we were trying to get at with this phrase, Hisheng Sheng. Which we can translate as mutually arising. All things are mutually arising. Why? Because all things are connected and interconnected to each other, interdependent on each other, and we cannot ultimately separate anything from anything else. All of the stuff that you see around you is in some sense a part of the same thing, so it doesn't make any sense to ultimately distinguish between them, because they're all informing and part of each other in a weird way. Thus, all things and events are mutually arising and are interdependent and interconnected. This describes what we might call the metaphysics of Taoism. But describing exactly how the world works is not what Taoism is trying to do. Ultimately, Taoism was formulated in response to this very chaotic and violent time, right, in Chinese history. Just as Confucianism was. Indeed, Chinese culture is informed very strongly by these two schools of thought, if you can call them that, Confucianism and Taoism. Within these philosophies, schools of thought, whatever you want to call them, there is again an insistence on experience rather than thought or understanding. And so ultimately, what I hope you take from the lecture today is some sort of experience. I cannot make you have that experience, but if you come to, in some sense, intuit what it is that Watts and other thinkers are trying to get at with all this, you will have that experience. And it is an experience that many have argued provides you with a kind of peace and security and fulfillment that you cannot get from trying to completely understand the world, plan, and control everything. Indeed, what separates Eastern philosophy from Western philosophy is what we might call a focus on attachment. Attachments to things. You have all kinds of attachments, right? You want to be seen a certain way. You want to feel validated by those around you. You wear certain clothes because you identify with them and you like them and they're your favorite. You drink certain coffees, right? Because you want to look cool or whatever. Maybe you engage in activism because you're afraid, oh shit, if I don't do that, I'm going to get criticized and persecuted. You have an attachment to security. You have an attachment to control, don't you? We in Western societies are conditioned to constantly think about the past and the present, to plan, to control, to figure out the kind of life we want to live, think about it all, get our plan, and then do it. Right? That's not what Taoism encourages or recommends. Indeed, as we shall see, understanding and practicing Taoism, like other Eastern philosophies, requires a shift in our psychology, in our action and our experience. So we have some sort of attachment to control, to understanding. Why? Because if we don't feel like we're controlling things, we have all this anxiety, right? And we're freaked out. Well, what Buddhism and Taoism are trying to get us to do is to give up those attachments. If we can do so, we'll acquire some sort of security that we would not be able to have trying to control and plan everything. Why? Because you can't control and plan everything. You can't even control how your friends see you. So how are you going to control how others out there in the world see you? You can't control how tall you are, how pretty you are, how smart you are. There's very little that we can control. Yet, we're so preoccupied with it, right? We're trying to achieve mastery over ourselves, over nature, over other people, so that we can make the world in our own image, because we think if we could just make the world in our own image, we're going to be happy. The Taoists say, no, you don't even understand the world, and you're not going to be able to make the world in your own image, okay? You're not smart or wise or virtuous enough to do that. Indeed, something that is characteristic of human nature, which the Taoists are like, we got to fucking stop doing that, is meddling with everything. Again, this comes from our attachment to control. We worry about ecosystems, so we feel like we need to go in and kill a bunch of wolves, right? We worry about social justice, so we got to go into communities and change how they do things and change our social and economic policy. But insofar as everything is part of the Tao, and the things that you see around you are particular manifestations of this process, or this flow, or this drift, there is a way that things naturally go, depending on the thing that it is. So one of the central ideas of Taoism is that everything operates only according to its own nature. But one of the reasons why everything is so fucked up is because we humans have the ability to go against our own nature and to make things not go as they're naturally going to go. For example, invasive species wouldn't be an issue if we didn't do all of this unnatural stuff and bring them from one continent to another. Ecosystems are self-regulating. But when we introduce a species that's not native to a place, because we're doing all this meddling and controlling with all this stuff, we cause problems. When you try to control how others see you, what their perceptions are of you, what the world is like, you end up causing more problems, right? And causing yourself more anxiety. The problem with human beings, Taoism implies, is that we're trying to meddle in everything. We're not allowing things to go their own way, to unfold naturally. We're trying to control them. And this is not good. This is causing problems. Okay? Another way of saying this is that things cannot be or act other than what they are. Except maybe for humans, right? And the problem is, we're trying to get things to be other than what they are, including ourselves, and we're mucking it up. In our project of mastering nature, we end up destroying it. In our projects of trying to control our society with all these laws and policies and rules, we end up making things worse and fomenting resentment and rebellion. The basic idea of Taoism is this: if everything is allowed to go its own way, the harmony of the universe will be established. Since every process in the world can do its own thing, only in relation to all others. This seems very counterintuitive, right? You're thinking to yourself, but we need to control things. We need to have a hand in how things go. Otherwise, there's going to be pain and suffering. Well, in a sense, that's true. But that idea or that expectation is based in part on arbitrary ideas about what we think is acceptable and not acceptable, what we think is good and bad, this dualistic way of dividing up the world. See, many, if not all problems, could be completely eliminated if you just changed your perspective. Starving is only a person to the problem who is clinging to life. Right? Freedom, or its lack, is only a problem to somebody who prioritizes it so much in their mind that they can't live without it. What Taoism asks us to do is to trust the world and to trust those around us. Because we're making things worse by trying to control others, and by trying to control the environment, and by trying to control these processes that we really don't understand. The Taoists are saying then that seen as a whole, the universe is a harmony or symbiosis of patterns which cannot exist without each other. However, when it is looked at section by section, we find conflict. The biological world is a mutual eating society in which every species is the prey of another. But if there were any species not preyed upon by another, it would increase and multiply to its own self-strangulation. As human beings, through their skill in defeating other species, are in danger of disrupting the whole biological order by overpopulation, and thus of destroying themselves. For this reason, anyone who sets out to govern the world puts everything, and especially himself, in danger. Those who would take over the world and manage it, I see that they cannot grasp it. For the world is a spiritual vessel, and cannot be forced. Whoever forces it, spoils it. Whoever grasps it, loses it. Thus, we must trust ourselves and others. Indeed, along with trying to rid us of our attachments, what Eastern philosophy is trying to get us to do is to engage in a radical trust and acceptance of the world. This is actually something that we see in some Western philosophies as well. For example, in Kierkegaard's Christian existentialism, the one who achieves a really fulfilled life is the one who has reconciled themselves to the world in all its beauty and its ugliness, radically accepted it for what it is. Because it is only by accepting it that one can then regain the world and really experience it to the extent that it is possible to be experienced, to be enjoyed, to be loved. We are causing a lot of problems because we lack trust in ourselves, others, and the processes of nature. Because we're trying to control and force things to go the way that we want them to go, to meddle in things. How do we do this? How exactly do we live in a way that trusts others, that allows us to feel secure in our lives, to be happy and fulfilled? The central practice is known as Wu Wei, which can be described by the term non-action. But it is not laziness. It is not just throwing your hands up and not doing anything. It's more nuanced than that. not mere passivity. What it means is acting intelligently with an intuitive understanding of how things go, such that you can achieve the best consequences without forcing or meddling anything, but following the course of nature, the course of human relationships, of social and economic processes. Achieving maximum benefit with minimal effort. That's basically what Wu Wei is. And thus he starts off chapter 4, Wu Wei, with this quote from the Tao Te Ching. The Tao does nothing, yet nothing is left undone. These famous words of Lao Tzu obviously cannot be taken in their literal sense, for the principle of non-action, Wu Wei, is not to be considered inertia, laziness, laissez-faire, or mere passivity. Among the several meanings of Wei are to be, to do, to make, to practice, to act out, and in the one symbol of this word, it means false, simulated, counterfeit. But in the context of Taoist writings, it quite clearly means forcing, meddling, and artifice. In other words, trying to act against the grain of what this stuff is doing. Thus, Wu Wei as not forcing is what we mean by going with the grain, rolling with the punch, swimming with the current, trimming one's sails to the wind, taking the tide at its flood, stooping to conquer. It is perhaps best exemplified in the Japanese arts of judo and aikido, where an opponent is defeated by the force of his own attack, right? Using somebody's momentum against them to easily flip them. You don't really have to do anything, except a little bit of that. And the latter art reaches such heights of skill that I have seen an attacker thrown to the floor without even being touched. The principle is illustrated by the parable of the pine and the willow in heavy snow. The pine branch, being rigid, cracks under the weight of the snow. But the willow branch yields to the weight and the snow drops off because it's flexible, right? Because it's light. It doesn't stay rigid. Note, however, that the willow is not limp but springy. Wu Wei is thus the lifestyle of one who follows the Tao and must be understood primarily as a form of intelligence. That is, of knowing the principles, structures, and trends of human and natural affairs so well that one uses the least amount of energy in dealing with them. But this intelligence is, as we have seen, not simply intellectual. It's not just about book smarts, right? Not just about philosophy and science. It is also the unconscious intelligence of the whole organism. So your gut feelings, your intuitions about things, the innate wisdom of the nervous system as well. Wu Wei is a combination of the wisdom with taking the line of least resistance in all of one's actions. It is not the mere avoidance of effort. In judo, for example, one uses muscle, but only at the right moment, when the opponent is off balance or has overextended himself. But even this effort has a peculiarly unforced quality, which is called qi, roughly equivalent to the Sanskrit prana, an energy associated with the breath. This may be illustrated with the Aikido exercise of the unbendable arm. The right arm is extended to the front, and the opponent is invited to bend it. If the arm is held rigidly, a strong opponent will certainly bend it. If, on the other hand, it is held out easily, with the eyes fixed on a distant point, and with the feeling that it is a rubber hose through which water is flowing to that point, it will be extremely difficult to bend. Without straining, one simply assumes that the arm will stay straight, come what may, because of the flow of qi. During the test, breathe out slowly, as if from the belly, and think of the breath as moving through the arm. This is perhaps a form of what we call, or rather miscall, self-hypnosis. I have found that something of the same kind can be used in opening a stiff cap on a jar. And I knew an old Zen master, frail in appearance, who, seemingly by leaning against them, moved heavy rocks which defeated stronger, younger men. Just as water follows gravity, and if trapped, rises to find a new outlet, so Wu Wei is the principle that gravity is energy, and the Taoist finds in gravity a constant stream which may be used in the same way as the wind or a current. Falling with gravity constitutes the immense energy of the Earth spinning in its orbit around the sun. Thus, what Taoism encourages us to do, if we are to find fulfillment, happiness, security, is to go with the flow of things. Not try to force and meddle in things, but to literally just do what comes naturally, in a sense, in a wise way, in an intelligent way, with an understanding of the forces and operations of others and nature. It means understanding all of this in some intuitive sense and utilizing its forces and patterns to your own benefit. This is a very different way of acting within the world than we engage in Western society, right? We are constantly stuck between regretting what we've done in the past and planning for the future, worrying about grades and our assignments and our lectures, worrying about what to wear. Why do you think I wore this today? I couldn't be bothered to put on a nice shirt and a tie. I was too tired. Just going with the flow of things, okay? And I knew that if I taught with that hoodie on, I'd get hot, so I had to take it off. This is a very different way of seeing and acting within the world. It is a way which cannot be taught. It is something that you must grasp yourself. Because it's not something that can really be understood, it's only something that can be done. See, the weird thing about Taoism is by me trying to explain it to you, I'm already off the mark. And what's even more paradoxical is if you try to live this way, you're not going to be living this way. Why? Because you're trying to force yourself to live this way. So you can't do it. You can't consciously or intentionally live this way. It just has to be something that eventually you fall into naturally. But the idea is, if you do cultivate this radical trust in others, in yourself, in your capacities, if you lean on your own intuitive understanding of the way that nature works and human society works, you can leverage all of that to great effect without having to grasp or control anything. Because you will be moving with the rhythms and the flows of what is around you. They're too big to be controlled anyway. In the West, we endlessly try to force, control, and grasp things, but this is the wrong way to live. In order to thus reach that point of fulfillment and peace and security that you are seeking, what a lot of Eastern thinkers, practitioners are going to say is, it's not by understanding these philosophical systems and applying them. It's just by going with the flow, man. Getting rid of that worry that you have, those attachments that you have to certain outcomes, to certain ideas. Acting as if you are a ball in a mountain stream, not somebody who's trying to hold back the river. In essence, this also involves not taking everything so seriously. Having some lightness in your life, okay? Engaging in play. Getting out of your own head, not spending all your time thinking about stuff all the time and overanalyzing and worrying and just drive yourself crazy doing that, right? But just doing what comes naturally. Cats are the perfect Taoists. Why? Cats don't try to force anything. What do? If a cat is hungry, it goes and eats. If it wants pets, it's going to come up to you and bother you, right? And then you're going to pet it because it's really cute. It doesn't have to force you to pet it. You're already going to do it, right? And it knows that implicitly. When it's sleepy, it goes and sleeps in a comfortable place. When it wants to look out the window and chitter at birds, that's what it's going to do. And when it gets sick of that, it goes and does something else. It doesn't force itself to look out the window. It doesn't force the world to conform to its own ideas and standards. We kind of conform to their standards because we think they're really cute, you know. For this reason, it's said that dogs look up to us, cats look down on us, and pigs look at us as equals. Be like a cat. When you're hungry, eat. When you're tired, sleep. When you want to think, think. But don't force yourself to do these things. If the Taoists are right, trying to do that and trying to force other people to do things is just going to end up blowing stuff up and making things worse. Our way of thinking and acting in this society is obviously not based on this way of life, right? It's very different. It's concerned with mastery and control and thought. Thus, if you're really going to get this, and if you're going to follow it, it's going to require you to completely reevaluate your understanding of the world and your actions within it. Your understanding of other people and how the universe works, what makes all this stuff up, and ultimately what's going to be your best strategy for dealing with all of this. Is it any wonder why your generation is the most depressed and anxious in history? We have such a complex world now, and we're asking you all to understand it and control it, and we're going to hand the reins to you eventually, and you're going to have to take control. Isn't that scary? Do you want that kind of pressure? Is that making you happy? Is it making you fulfilled? Or would you be happier and more fulfilled if you just let go? If you just did what came naturally to you? If you let others do what came naturally to them? If you didn't fixate on certain outcomes, certain ideas of what kind of student you're supposed to be, what kind of things you're supposed to think, what kind of things you're supposed to do? Doing all that is just heaping pressure on yourself. Taking on burdens that you need not take on. So, Taoism implies. Yes, this way of thinking is very different from what we're used to. And I know you're thinking to yourself, Professor Gunnar, I can't do this. What the fuck are you talking about? I got to get a job. I got to survive. I got to get those good grades. I guess kinda. But you don't have to do those things in the same way that you're doing it now. Think about your weekends. Friday comes around. Are you thinking about having to go back to school on Monday? Going back to your job? Sunday rolls around, you're like, oh my God, I gotta go back to school tomorrow, I gotta go back to work. You look at your phone, it's 2 a.m., you're like, I gotta fall asleep now, I'll only get 5 hours of sleep. You're driving yourself crazy with those thoughts, right? Taoism says, just let it go. Live in the present moment. In some sense, there are no problems to anybody who just lives in the now. Where do all of your problems come from? Your thoughts and musings on the past and future? That's where your anxiety comes from, right? Getting caught up in your own head? Overthinking, overanalyzing? This way of life arose in order to deal with the very chaotic, violent times that these people were experiencing. And many were able to cultivate a peace and a security that we in the West can only dream of. One might say they lived a more enjoyable, simpler way of life. So what's the answer? Well, according to this way of being, it's to just go with the flow. Not worry so much, not overthink, not force yourself or anybody else to do anything, but to let things go their own way. In some sense, the central idea of Eastern thought is that these attachments that we have are holding us back and they're holding us down. My hand's all green, that's kind of cool. That's basically what Watts is trying to describe for us in this piece. Again, it is a way of seeing and acting within the world that is very different from what we're doing right now. It may seem crazy, it may seem woo-woo, unwise, but for some cultures, this way of thinking and being has been responsible for some of the most amazing art and society that you can imagine. That's Taoism. But again, if you're going to live this way, you can't intentionally or consciously do so. It's just something that you have to experience and grasp for yourself. For this reason, the masters of Eastern philosophy, like the Zen masters, teach by what's called direct pointing. They don't explain anything to their students. They just point out what is what. And then the students must experience it for themselves. So what do you think of this? Does this seem nice? Does this seem scary? Do you like what's being said here? What's being advocated for here? Or are you like, I don't fucking know. I just want to watch The Bachelor. That's your thing. Fucking do your thing, you know? If you want to leave, just leave. Yeah, I'm not going to stop you. I'm here because I want to be here. I love teaching. I love talking about this stuff. What do you all think of it? Yeah.
I like the concept and the idea of it, but like with the way that like our society is, like it feels like you can't even like you know like not try because you obviously can't try, but like you can't fall into this way of thinking.
Okay.
Because like kind of like you said, like the world's so scary and like they're putting things into our hands and it's like, well, how am I supposed to like relax?
Yeah.
Like it's constantly like so anxious and overwhelmed.
I think what we've gotten from the last few lectures is that your ability to relax is something that is under your control. Although if you look at the world through this way, it's not, right? Because you can't really control, I mean, you can control some stuff, but that's unwise. I can empathize, though, with this being kind of scary. Because this way of thinking and acting is completely the opposite of what we're taught we're supposed to do, right? After all, things got to be managed. Shit needs to get done. The lights need to stay on. The funny thing is, they don't have to. At least according to this thought. If you're worried about that stuff, what it reveals is that you have an attachment to it. Which some people would say is good. It's not bad. But I think the question that you should ask yourselves is, are those attachments serving you? Are they good for you? Which is a very difficult thing to figure out. What do the rest of y'all think? Do you like what Watts is presenting here? Or is this kind of like, that's stupid stuff? Just a little too heavy for a Monday morning. The funny thing is, you don't have to understand it. You can't. So no pressure. I may test you on it though, so maybe a little pressure. But you don't have to get it right. Who cares what grades you get? I don't care. I'm not going to feel any judgment or disappointment. Don't worry about what I think. I know you all feel a certain way though. You all want to do well. Yeah.
I think with just how our society is structured, since it's so deeply rooted in Western philosophy and thinking, this radical shift to Eastern thinking wouldn't work for the average person.
Yeah.
They would still have to live in that society.
Yeah, that's a worry, right? I mean, we've constructed our educational system, our social system, our economic and political system on these concepts, these ideas, these ways of life that are so ingrained, it's like, how are we going to do without them now? Maybe doing without them is going to fuck everything up. Yeah. Is anybody else kind of worried about that? They're like, look, the idea is nice, but there's no way anybody could do this in the U.S. Yeah? You want to speak into that a little bit?
Well, I feel like if I wasn't a senior right now, maybe I could appreciate this more. Every day is like the stress of, getting a job and finding where to move and what to do with your life and like having it, I don't know, maybe if I was like 80, I feel like you could have this vibe.
Yeah.
When everything's like settled. Or when you're really young and you don't have much control and you can let your parents take over. But I feel like we're at the worst time to have a go with the flow attitude.
Okay. It's interesting that you say that because within Chinese culture specifically, this kind of way of thinking and acting was something that often elderly people did when they checked out of society. Because they, had some sort of tradition to uphold, some sort of responsibilities, a family to make and, manage and raise. But I wonder if there aren't some ideas here that might be helpful to us, even in our Western society. Yeah, maybe we can't go full bore with it right now. But let me ask you this. If you didn't get a job, if you're having a hard time finding a job, would your parents let you move back in with them?
Well, yeah, but I wouldn't want to do that forever. That's kind of lame,
No, I hear you. I guess what comes to mind is, and I was right in your shoes, I was somebody who was extremely worried about a lot of things, stressed and anxious. I was a perfectionist when it came to school. That's why it was really stupid for me to major in physics, but I finished it out of pride. That was another attachment I had. Once I stopped holding myself to those standards, life got a lot better. That's a very hard thing to do, though. And it might not be right for you, Find out what works for you. Find out what's right for you. What I hope to have done in this class is given you a bunch of tools and perspectives to help you figure that out. So keep thinking about this stuff. Talk about it with your friends. Only you can decide how you're going to live. Okay. Any questions, concerns, comments? Okay. I'll let y'all go then. On Wednesday, we'll have our review day. So come with any questions you might have about anything. And then Monday, we'll have our final. And it shouldn't take you the full hour and a half. I've had students complete the final in a half hour. So study the essay questions that I uploaded, because I'm going to take 3 of them at random, and I'm going to put them on the final, and then you're going to choose one of those 3 to write. Okay?